this evening. We have an hour and we're going to stick to the hour. I'd like to refresh your memory on Bill Janklow's history. Just a thumbnail biography, if you will. No one yet has written a biography of Bill Janklow, and my book is not a biography, it's just a novel. And perhaps some of you have read it, but it just came out here last week. So, and it's nearly 300 pages. So I wouldn't expect everyone to have read it at this point, except some of the faithful, like Bob Fuller over here on the side. So let's talk a little bit about Bill Janklow's history. And then I want to talk about how a novelist, or how I approached the material, and how I wrote the book. So Bill Janklow was born in 1939. He was born in Chicago, and his parents were his mother was from Flanders, South Dakota, Luella, and his father was, at least they were living in Chicago at the time, and he was an attorney. In 1950, or in the late 1940s, I should say, Bill's father, Art Janklow, was appointed to be one of the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials in Germany. So clearly, he was one hell of an attorney, and highly respected, because those were positions that were sought after. The irony is, when he got over to Germany, his commanding officer told him that he would be defending the Nazis, because, in American justice, everyone deserves representation. Well, as a Jew, Art Janklow just could not do that. And so he protested to his commanding officer, and they finally agreed, and he ended up being on the prosecuting team. Well, shortly thereafter, Art Janklow had a heart attack and died in Germany. So that left it up to his mother, Luella, to take all 6 children, put them in a cargo plane, and flew them back to the United States. They stayed in Chicago for a while, a few years, and then they moved back to Flanders, where she was from. It didn't take long for Bill Janklow to get into trouble. He was a self-confessed delinquent, and he got into trouble with 4 or 5 other guys who were harassing a 17-year-old girl. And apparently it was pretty serious, because the judge gave Bill Janklow a choice: either go to Plankington, which at the time was the juvenile prison in South Dakota, or enlist in the military. And Bill chose enlisting in the military, and he went into the Marines. He served in the Marines for 3 years, and he was injured. He was shot in the leg moving some transport in Taiwan, and came back to the United States after his service. Went to USD, persuaded them that he did, without a high school degree, persuaded them that he could do college work. And how he fast talked the admissions committee, I don't know, but knowing Bill Janklow, I suspect that was probably a pretty easy task for him. At any rate, he finished undergrad and went to law school and graduated in 1966. His appointment he had an important appointment then right after law school. First as an attorney in legal services on the Rosebud Reservation, part of the war against poverty that Lyndon Johnson had rolled out. He came to the Rosebud, worked for legal services, and shortly thereafter he was appointed director of legal services on the Rosebud Reservation. And in that 6 years, he served 6 years, handled something like 4,300 requests for help from natives on the Rosebud Reservation and the Pine Ridge Reservation during that period of time. Never lost a case while he was there. After serving for 6 years, he resigned his position. And here was one of the more interesting pivots in South Dakota political history. He resigned his position as defender of Native people on the Rosebud Reservation and took a job with the Attorney General in South Dakota at the time, Kermit Sandy, to prosecute Indians. This was during the AIM period, and the tensions were high in South Dakota. But for whatever reason, probably ambition more than anything else, and certainly not ideological leanings, because Bill Janklow, in his early years, undergrad and while he was in law school, wanted to save the world. I mean, he was flaming liberal. But when he was at this crossroads, he took this job with Kermit Sandy and the Attorney General's job, or Attorney General's office in Pierre, and began prosecuting Native Americans who had rioted at the Custer County Courthouse in 1973. Well, shortly after taking on that job and completing the prosecution of everyone except Dennis Banks in that Custer County Courthouse riot, he resigned his job and he announced his candidacy for Attorney General at the time that he was working for the Attorney General, Kermit Sandy. So, again, another very interesting pivot in his personal politics, deciding to run against Kermit Sandy, who again was the standing Attorney General at the time. That campaign was perhaps one of the dirtiest, ugliest campaigns in South Dakota history. And there's a lot to tell about that, but I'll just leave you with one event. During that campaign that Bill Janklow lived with for the rest of his political and personal life. And that was an accusation that was made by a woman by the name of Jacinta Eagledeer, who came with several other people, Rich Barnes, who was a white legislator from Sioux Falls, and a contingent of AIM-leaning natives on the Rosebud Reservation, including Dennis Banks, came to Sioux Falls during the campaign now, and it was just 2 weeks away from the election. They announced a press conference, and at that press conference, again, this woman, Jacinta Eagledeer, said that testified that Bill Janklow had raped her while she was on the Rosebud Reservation. She had served as a babysitter for the Janklow family a number of times, and she came out with this shocking news, which Bill Janklow immediately denied very forcefully, and went on 2 weeks later to win the election. Despite that headwind, he won the election. And he won it by 57% of the vote, which, the way our politics are now, 57% of the vote, that's a lot of, well, that's a wide margin. You don't expect that kind of a margin anymore. So he won the Attorney General's job, and he began prosecuting a number of other natives who had gotten into trouble in South Dakota, and most importantly, most of the eyes were on the prosecution of Dennis Banks. And in fact, Dennis Banks was already building a national following, and the sentiment for Native American issues was growing in this country. Notwithstanding that, Bill Janklow went on to prosecute Dennis Banks in Custer. And over the course of about 6 months, won a prosecution for rioting charges against Dennis Banks. And of course, if you know the history at all, you remember that Dennis Banks fled. He was sentenced 2 weeks later, and he didn't show up for his sentencing, of course, which Bill Janklow said he wouldn't. Protested to the judge, "You can't let this guy go. He's going to flee," and he did. And that's what caused the famous fleeing and then the route that Dennis Banks took over that period of time, with Bill Janklow hot on his heels. First he was in California, then he went up to Oregon and Washington, and then back to California, and then finally out to a reservation in New York, where he stayed for most of the time, and where he was interviewed by Newsweek magazine while he was on this reservation in New York. And he submitted to Newsweek that and they accepted the, primarily Dennis Banks' side of the story, not Bill Janklow's side of the story, that Janklow was after him and was following him throughout the country, making his life miserable. And long story short, the Newsweek story created, again, a good deal of support and empathy for Dennis Banks. Dennis Banks finally did came back to South Dakota and was prosecuted again, or not, he wasn't prosecuted. The judge then sentenced him to 3 years in prison in South Dakota. So shortly after that, as his term was ending, Bill Janklow's term was ending as Attorney General in South Dakota. And this is, we're in about 1977 now. We're approaching the governor's race in 1978. Bill Janklow decided to run for governor rather than another term as Attorney General. And he ran a good race, a compelling race. He blew out he ran as a Republican, and there were other Republicans, of course, who wanted that nomination as well. And he beat them rather resoundingly. And then he went on to beat a man by the name of Roger McKellips, who hailed right outside of Vermillion here. And it's just north of, pardon me?
Alcester.
Yeah, no.
Somewhere near theirs.
Yes. Where was Jerry? Where was that?
He's a banker's.
Yeah, the banker's home. At any rate, he won. He beat Roger McKellips rather convincingly as well. But find where he. I can't find that percentage, but he beat. Oh. Janklow won with 67% of the vote, which is, again, an astounding percentage margin. You don't see those kinds of margins anymore. Even in this state, when Republicans run, generally, they're not, especially if it's statewide office, you're rarely going to find that kind of margin. So he went on then to serve 2 terms, 4 years apiece, so 8 years in that period of time, and his service at that time, those 8 years were years when he achieved a good deal of many political victories, and some of them very big political victories. One was the first issue that was facing Janklow when he was elected in 1978 was the railroads. The railroads were abandoning railroad track in South Dakota, right and left. after, a century or so of overregulation and bad management on their part, they couldn't support all the lines that they had in South Dakota. And so they were abandoning them. And Janklow came and he proposed to the state legislature that we buy track and keep it as a core system in South Dakota, primarily in eastern South Dakota. And he was ultimately successful in that, raised the sales tax 1 penny for a year and a half, I think it was, to raise $25 million to buy a railroad on behalf of the citizens of South Dakota, and then contracted with Burlington Northern to run rolling stock on the track. And some of that core system is right outside of Vermillion here. That line was part of the core system that was purchased at that time. Janklow then persuaded and had another large victory, but when he persuaded Citibank to come to South Dakota and build a credit card processing center in Sioux Falls. That was a huge political victory. He needed to persuade the legislature before Citibank actually could come and establish themselves, domicile themselves in South Dakota. By federal law, the state legislature had to pass a law inviting Citibank to come to South Dakota, inviting this federal bank to come to South Dakota, and they did. And so Citibank came, and it has been, in my estimation, an unqualified success. Citibank has grown over that period of time. Many of us probably are sitting on Citibank cards right now, and they have provided a lot of good jobs, a lot of clean jobs, and a lot of IT jobs in this state. Completing that first 8 years, then Janklow did some consulting. He consulted with and then ultimately was appointed general counsel for the South Dakota Mining Association for the purpose of defeating 2 mining measures that were before the state of South Dakota at that time. Jerry Wilson, who is with us here this evening, Jerry and others had proposed 2 measures, one to raise the tax on gold and other minerals that were extracted from the mining areas, and 2, to return the site where they had strip mined and taken all the gold, to return it to its natural contours. Well, Bill Janklow was on the side that wanted to mine, and Jerry Wilson and others were on the other side to stop these 2 mining measures. And it ended up, or at least one of the interesting features, and I've got this in the book, is a debate between Jerry Wilson and Bill Janklow. So we still have that on tape, and I watched it before writing the book, and Jerry did a marvelous job of standing up to Bill Janklow, who was, no wallflower by any means. It was a good, raucous back and forth debate. The rest of the time, Bill Janklow was serving as, as a lawyer here in Sioux Falls until one of the greatest tragedies, or political tragedies anyway, the state of South Dakota would ever experience was the death of George Mickelson in an airplane crash in Iowa. And everyone grieved that death. George Mickelson was a fine man and beloved in many parts of South Dakota. When he was killed in that plane crash, Bill Janklow, along with the rest of us, shed many tears, but that also lit the fire of ambition in Bill Janklow, because this gave him an opportunity to run again for governor, which he did. And he ran first against a Dakota Wesleyan College president up in Mitchell, South Dakota. His name was Jim Betto. And he had a running mate by the name of Jim Abbott. We've all heard that name before, of course. And they lost just as all the other previous opponents of Bill Janklow did rather resoundingly. I think that was 57% again of the vote for Janklow. And so he went on to another 4 years and then ran against Bernie Hunoff in 1994. No, 1998. He ran against Bernie Hunoff, publisher, of course, of South Dakota Magazine. And Bernie, as a populist, he's an amiable man, and he ran a good campaign, honing on primarily on some of the corruption that had begun to seep into Bill Janklow's political life. But to no avail again, Bill Janklow prevailed and continued to be our governor. He had many accomplishments in those last 2 terms, the last 8 years. And I make this distinction in the book, but they were primarily, if the first 8 years were a wonderful display of political courage and leadership by Janklow, the last 2 terms were more the managerial Janklow, where he was fixing things throughout the government. In fact, when he was reelected in 1994, he came with a long list of things that he wanted to do in the government. So, he was always applying himself to, fixing what he saw as not things that weren't working in South Dakota. And most of those things had bipartisan support. Not all of them, certainly, because Bill Janklow, was a controversial man, and he did things. He was. If you're ever around him, you knew that if he came to you with something to do, you would do it pretty damn quick because the train was rolling in that direction, and you didn't want to be in the way. As his 4th term ended, Bill Janklow was casting about what he would do. And came up with a decision, and this was a candidacy that he really didn't want to take on. But of course, he wanted the limelight, he wanted the applause. So he ran for a U.S. House seat that was open at the time, filled by Stephanie Herseth, who was an up and coming rock star in South Dakota politics and elsewhere as well. And unfortunately, he beat her. He had 54% of that vote. So again, every time he ran, even when there was significant Janklow fatigue in the state, he was still, he was still a formidable politician and had a strong pull on the state of South Dakota and its voters. About midway through that first 2-year term, fate turned on Bill Janklow. He was coming back from a meeting in Aberdeen in Brown County, where he had met with some Korean War veterans about some veterans issues, I'm sure. He was coming back with a staffer, and he was driving. He always insisted on driving, and he always insisted on driving several miles an hour over the speed limit. He was an inveterate speeder. He had tickets that he had so many tickets he probably could have filled his back trunk with them. And this time, fate caught up with him, and he was going through an intersection near Trent, South Dakota, just north of Brandon, where he lived at the time. And he came into this intersection and did not stop. So he was going at least 70 miles an hour, and he hit a motorcyclist who was in the intersection, a man by the name of Randy Scott. And that led to Bill's conviction for second-degree manslaughter. And so here, the icon of South Dakota politics the man who ran the state and ran it with an iron fist, was brought down by this car accident, and the judge sentenced him, a Moody County judge, no less. That's where Flandreau is located. Moody County judge sentenced him to 100 days in jail. And he spent that time in Minnehaha County Jail. They had just built a new jail there, and he had a wing all to himself. As governor, he did still have perks. And there are a couple scenes in the book in that wing where he was in jail. A couple scenes that there were a lot of fun writing. I had had some good source information about what Janklow did while he was in jail for those 100 days, and it's a big reveal, so I'm not going to tell you. You'll have to read the book, and you'll have to get pretty darn close to the end of the book before you find that out. And subsequent to that, Janklow served for about 8 years as an attorney, taking up, he took up cases certainly where there was a good deal of money involved. And he also took up a lot of cases where someone was down on their luck or needed representation and wasn't able to find an attorney and didn't have money, or, whatever it might have been. Bill had a soft spot for that, and he did much of that pro bono work as well during that time. Then in the fall of 2011, Janklow was diagnosed with brain cancer. And it was a swift end for him. In January then of 2012, he died. And peaceful death at the Dougherty home in hospice in Sioux Falls. So that's the Bill Janklow biography. And so one of the questions there are many questions that I faced in writing this book, as you can well imagine. First was, which material do I use? I mean, there's an enormous amount of material in this man's life. I mean, I just scratched the surface here. We could be here for the next 2 hours, me pontificating about what Bill Janklow did over that period of time. So there was this big mass of material. The second question was, what is the structure going to be like? How do I structure this so that it's readable, but yet still credible? Still an honest portrayal of Bill Janklow. By the way, speaking of all the material, someone once told me that, you're writing a book about Bill Janklow. Good luck keeping that to 1,000 pages. And it was rather difficult condensing all that material and finding the right structure. And then most importantly, I thought was, what is my point of view? What sort of a narrator am I going to have in this book? And, would it be the first person narrator that I relating, talking about his experiences with Bill Janklow? Or would it be a third person narrator where the writer acts as sort of an omniscient God going into what he or she is thinking in the book, in the action, in the dialogue? And ultimately I chose a first person narrator. I had written my first book using a first person narrator, and I'd grown sort of comfortable using that. And I also think that a first person narrator creates more intimacy for the reader. It just, it's just a lot easier for the writer if you handle the material correctly, and if you create some interest in the narrator, him or herself. You have to have that. Without that, you're not going to have, your reader is soon going to close the book and say, well, I've read enough of this, I'm old enough now to do that. I don't have all that much time left, and I'm going to read what I want to read and not not something that's no longer compelling for me. So I chose the first person narrator, and that leads me to a reading that I'm going to have here. And this is opening few pages of Janklow. Starting line. From I-90, you take Highway 83 north, and then you drive and drive through ranch land, miles and miles of prairie ravines heaving like the swells of the deep sea, the anguished voices of pioneer wives gone mad, echoing in the nothingness. You will see sage, purple clover, and the shy pasque flower poking up where the plow has not broken the virgin soil. The first town you reach is Fort Pierre, with no sign of a fort, but a quilt of small buildings and gas stations and a honky-tonk, a silver spur, and a steakhouse, the Chateau. The river bluff drops gently as you enter Fort Pierre, leading to a bridge that crosses the Missouri, tamed by the mighty Oahe Dam a few miles north, and on to Pierre, the capital of South Dakota. I was driving my BMW motorcycle, pushing it hard that morning in the late spring, 1973, to make it to Pierre in time for an appointment. It was a warm, wet June day, fresh rain on the prairie grass sweetening the air. I felt as free as I ever would. I had just finished law school at Yale. The last year was not as mind-numbing as the first two. Nonetheless, it was law school, the study of ancient centuries rules. I was losing my interest in the law, and I hadn't thought a lot about what I would do that summer. I returned home after spring exams to live with my parents until I found a job in my home state. My job search didn't go well. Most of the law firms had already filled their openings with graduates, and to be real, they're probably not interested in a Yale graduate who might have unrealistic demands about what kind of law he wanted to practice and how much he wanted to be paid for it. I spent a good part of those June days feeling sorry for myself, avoiding my parents' judgmental glances and spending too much time in the local bars searching for last call romances. And then a high school friend, Harry Menchikoff, telephoned. We called him Harry M for obvious reasons. Harry M had just graduated from the state's law school and was working in the Attorney General's office in Pierre. He phoned and said there was a job opening with the Chief Prosecutor, a close friend of his. He went on at length about this guy's legal skills and charisma. I was intrigued. I asked him to set up an interview. I entered the Attorney General's office on the third floor of the Capitol building in time. I was still dressing like it was the 60s, carrying my helmet, long hair down to my collar, jeans, blue chambray, work shirt, and engineer boots. The woman at the front desk was reading something and did not look up immediately. She had long black hair, a permanently inscrutable expression, and an icy demeanor, which I would discover melted easily. Her nameplate read Sharon LeBeau. Sitting on a bench beside the reception desk, obviously chatting Sharon up, was a guy in jeans, a faded yellow t-shirt, and hush puppies. Pack of pell-mells was rolled up in his sleeve, revealing a dark blue marine tattoo on his arm below a polio shot scar the size of a quarter. His hair was cut short, parted on the left side. He clutched a Coke can in his right hand, the fat fingers squeezing it like it was his life savings. He had a slight bulge around his waist, but otherwise looked fit. He wore a pair of big black glasses, a size too large for his face. I thought he was the janitor. I turned my attention back to Sharon, but he growled a question. "Hey, buddy, what the fuck are you doing here?" This guy had a heavy lisp as well. "I'm here to interview," I said firmly, hoping my tone would end the conversation, caution not to swear back in front of Sharon, though she didn't strike me as someone who would be offended. "Hi, Jake. We were expecting you," she said, and handed me a folder of HR documents, smiling for some reason. "Complete this form and then report to Mr. Janklow, the chief prosecutor," she said, pointing at the guy on the bench. Mr. Janklow's face broke into a big, wide, all is forgiven grin and said, "Come on back, buddy. I'll take care of you." Usually, the term was usually buddy until Bill liked you and trusted you. For some, it would always be buddy. For some, a lot worse. I followed him back to his office, walking a full step faster than I usually do, and the cigarette smoke clouding the trail. Before reaching his office, he stopped and stuck his head into another office across from his. "Harry, help me interview this guy, your friend," he said, barking the order. His office looked like a study hall before finals, books piled up everywhere where he found an open spot, ashtrays spewing butts, documents stacked on the floor. Janklow and I'll end it there. So that's how the book opens, and it stays with the first person narrator from that point on through the book. So I probably talked too long already. So I'll open it up to questions about the book. Yes, sir.
Is Mr. Keating a real person?
No, more than any of the characters, Mr. Keating was a product of my imagination. Now, there are writers here in this audience who know that regardless of who you write, if you're writing fiction, regardless of how heavily you might depend on a single person, you might have someone in mind when you're writing a fictional book, you end up with some of your own characteristics and characters and other characteristics that you picked up from other people that you might have used as a model for that person in this.
So there might have been some people that were a model for the protagonist, Mr. Keating.
Yes. Yeah, there were, but it's a shifting kind of thing where Bill Janklow, in many respects, was a very transactional person. But he did have, a loyal following, certainly, of friends, but he kept them largely in the background, and, did his business, if someone was helpful for him, or whether a legislature or a staff person or whomever, they came together, they agreed on what they wanted to do, and that was it. And then Bill just went on to other things.
Is your book for sale here tonight? You have
No, I don't, but it is for sale at Outside a Dog, which is just a block
right
over.
across the parking lot.
Yes, yeah.
I'm gonna buy a copy for a gentleman in a nursing home who worked for quite a few years for a pharmacist in Pierre. And he witnessed an illegal device installed in Mr. Janklow's car, illegal radar device. Probably the only one of two in South Dakota that was ever installed.
Really? Yeah. Bill Janklow also had one of these portable lights that you can put on top of your car that spins like a police light. He had one of those in his car, and whenever, he wanted to get out of town fast.
When he had too many tickets, he resorted to the light.
Right, right. Well, yeah, he was a walking contradiction, partly truth and partly fiction.
One of his last acts was to buy a piece of lawn equipment out from under me. I answered an ad in the newspaper. I don't remember exactly what city it was in, but the owner of the equipment said, I'm sorry, I just sold it to the governor. He said he'd be over to pick it up, and I think he'll be good for his money. And that was after I witnessed the closing of the Springfield College. I had a contract to repair office machines at Vermillion, and Springfield went along with it. So when he marched in there and he didn't march in there, and you didn't cover it in the book, but the story I heard was that he sent people from Vermillion over to take the records right out from under the people in the office with no warning and transfer those records back to Vermillion. And supposedly there was a lawsuit in effect where the Christian congregation or whatever that had started that college, teachers college, had in their contract originally that it would revert back to them if the state of South Dakota no longer needed it. And so that lawsuit was being pursued while he strong-armed the records out of the office, in front of a surprised staff there. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't.
Well, I had
The
that
only thing I
against
know
him.
about that part of the Springfield story, and that it's a long, very interesting moment in South Dakota's political history.
Yeah,
The only, of course, they were a branch campus of the University of South Dakota here. And one of my good friends who died way too early, Roger Kozak, was in charge of moving all of the records and files from Springfield back here to University of South Dakota. And he had to be escorted with highway patrol
yeah.
at the time because there was so much bad blood over the closing of Springfield. And
I lost a chunk of my income when he changed it over to a prison. And then there was the lawnmower incident. So I had a very low opinion of Governor Janklow, but that's somewhat mellowed by reading your book because you showed the human side of him.
Okay, thank you. All right, other questions? Yeah, Bob.
There is the other side of Bill Janklow that you kind of touch on in the book. He was quite generous in helping people financially. He did a lot of good things that a lot of people simply didn't know about.
Yeah, Bill Janklow was, when it came to his own personal finances and his charitable gifts, he didn't want anybody to know about it, whatever he might have
He
done.
was pretty quiet about it.
He was very quiet about it. I mean, he was the first guy to talk about his political accomplishments, but when he helped out people, especially on that personal level, he would do it generously and affectionately, and without applause. He didn't look for applause for that. There's so many sides to Bill Janklow that, I only touch on it in the book. I don't get into it in great detail because, well, frankly, it doesn't make for good drama. It just doesn't. But that's why I continue to harp on this need for a good biography of Bill Janklow. Every time I see Kurt Hacknar, I tell him, you've got to cultivate some rising star in the history department. As you know, Kurt was a history professor before he became vice president for academic affairs here. You've got to cultivate some rising star in the history department before they go on to some research institution to get their PhD to begin writing the biography of Bill Janklow. But nothing so far. And
I guess the starting point that was mentioned in your book might be Mr. Damgard, who wrote a summary of the Springfield closing. And I intend to look him up or look up whatever he published on that. And thanks for putting that in the book.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. Other questions?
How well did you know Bill Janklow?
I wasn't in the inner circle. I was immediately outside of that inner circle. I was on the budget office staff, but I did have a lot of interface with him. Budget analysts were assigned a group of agencies. So of all the agencies, a big pie in the government, each analyst would get a piece of that pie. And during the budget season, the analyst would sit down with Janklow in the conference room right off on the other side of the hall from where the governor's office is, and spend, an entire afternoon with him. Especially, he wasn't a guy to do, he wasn't real crisp about doing a lot of his business. I mean, he would take his time, and of course he'd go off in, directions that led you gosh knows where, and 15 minutes later, you'd finally get back to well, Governor, what about this? So I ended up spending a lot of time with him that way, but I wasn't in the inner circle. I knew many of my friends were, though, and that many were a source of information in writing the book. Kevin, you had a question?
Yeah, I didn't connect the dots until you talked about the hiatus between the terms when he was working for the mining company and opposed the tax on. But didn't you say in his second stint that he did go to deal with the budget shortfall? He did impose tax on mining?
Yes, well, in fact, he was. That's another irony in his political career because
defended Indians and prosecuted them, defended mining companies, then taxed them.
Yeah. When he was first elected, and I was at the budget office at this time and dealt with this problem in a minuscule scale compared to what Bill Janklow had to do. But when he was elected governor, the year before, the legislature had rescinded the personal property tax in South Dakota. And when they did that, that created a $40 million hole in the budget. And you can imagine how large that, there's been a lot of inflation. So that would have been, hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms. But at any rate, the legislature had created that hole, and that's what he inherited. And one of the ways that he closed that budget hole was to raise the tax on gold mining, and Homestake was the big player in South Dakota at the time. And that was like David trying to slay Goliath because Homestake had their way with South Dakota really until the late 1930s, when South Dakota was desperate for, again, they had a huge budget shortfall. And the populists in the legislature at that time, and we had a lot of populists in the late 30s in this legislature. One of the leaders was a man by the name of Emil Lorix. He championed this gold tax, and they finally did pass, and I think it was a 3% extraction tax at that time, passed this gold tax, and the revenue generated was equal to 1/3 of the budget of the state of South Dakota at the time. So it really saved the state's budget, the state's finances at that time. And then turn around a couple of years later, after having brought Homestake to their knees, then he turns around and takes a consulting job for $100,000 a month to fight these two mining measures. So, I mean, the man was capable of, very adroit at, changing his position. Don Dilling taught me this a long time ago. Where you sit is how you stand. And, if you're sitting in a different position, you stand differently. So, okay, another question.
It seems like he wasn't really ideological. I mean, he didn't seem to. Now, what about the cement plant? What's the deal on that?
Yeah. There again, that's kind of interesting. There was not really a pivot, but there was a change in Bill Janklow's view of, or how he approached the cement plant. While he was governor, both in his first 8 years and then in his second 8 years. In his first 8 years, in fact, was it his first or second term? I've forgotten which now. Bill Janklow, during his lifetime, he argued a case before the Supreme Court 3 times. 3 times before the Supreme Court of the United States. One of the times was when the cement plant had refused to sell cement to an out-of-state business because there was a shortage of cement, and because it was a state cement plant, they wanted to serve South Dakota contractors first before out-of-state contractors. Makes sense. It's after all, it's our cement plant. But this out-of-state, they're a Wyoming group, sued South Dakota, and it made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And Janklow won that case. And he, at the time, when he argued that case, Reeves versus Stake, he was the only sitting governor who ever argued a case before the US Supreme Court. And that may still be the case, that he was the only sitting governor who's ever argued a case before the court. So that's the first step in the cement plant case situation. And that was during his first 8 years. And then during his last eight years, he proposed to the legislature that we sell the state cement plant. And I think you can argue that both 2 ways. One, that he may have sold us down the river for who knows what on that particular case, or he may have correctly realized or recognized that the market at that time was pricing the cement plant as high a market price as it may ever have reached, and decided that at that point we should sell that asset and turn it into another asset, which would be cash, and serve as and it still does, serves as in effect an endowment in the state of South Dakota's finances and pays for South Dakota's bills. It creates revenue off of that asset, like any other investment, and that revenue goes into the state of South Dakota. Now, was there something behind the scenes on that? I don't know. But someone that I know promised me, in fact, it was Steve Zellmer, who I talked to just recently, who was on the state, it was the manager of the state cement plant during this time, promised to tell me something about that sale that the next time I see him over a beer. So that may be a year or two from now, Norma, but when it happens,
All right.
I'll give you a call.
Thank you. All right. Fascinating.
Other questions?
In terms of sources, where did you get your sources for your book? Or, as you were writing it?
Yeah, sure. Well, I did quite a bit of research, but the record, pantry is sort of bare on that. I spent a good deal of time up at USD has the William J. Janklow's papers. And I thought, this is going to be a gold mine, and I'm going to find out a lot about the inside of what was going on in the Janklow administration. And there just isn't a whole lot there at all. I mean, they're the, things that you might expect there, but there's nothing juicy. There's nothing, there's no meat there, unfortunately. So, and because there's no biography, there's been no history of Bill Janklow written. I had to resort to anecdotes, what my friends and other sources would tell me, relate to me about Bill Janklow. I had my own experiences, of course. And then finally, journalism, the newspaper reports and stories. And the occasional column in South Dakota newspapers. But that was it. So, thankfully, they're all digitized now and easily searched. So I searched through, all 8 years of his first set of terms and that second 8 years very carefully. And that's where I sort of put the framework together of what I was going to write about. And had, you know, had all my, if you will, the scenes that I wanted to write. And then I, you know, after that, then I started to put, you know, the dialogue and action together behind in those scenes. And I did them all one after another, after another, after another. And consequently, to some degree, if you read the book, it might appear just a little bit episodic. That's true to an extent, because many of the chapters have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Not all of them, but some of them do. But, you know, that was pretty much it. You know, it's thankfully, all of that information is now available. And I did do a couple other things. I did the University of Minnesota Historical Archives has an AIM collection. And in that AIM collection, there's a lot of interesting stuff, because they, of course, Bill Janklow was their sworn enemy. And there's all sorts of wild rumors about Janklow and what he did while he was on the reservation, none of which I could, you know, were true, but they're just wild, crazy stories about him. He and his wife having a baby while they were in Vermillion, and he took it down to the river and drowned it, and all sorts of wild stuff. But I will say that the AIM collection also has some good information. I also obtained, when I was working in Pierre, the transcript of the Dennis Banks trial. And that's a pile of papers about this high. And it was a great source of information about you know, not only what you could see in the court, but when they retired to the judges' chambers, I had all that dialogue in the transcript. And, you know, a lot of it wasn't that usable in the novel, but some was. And I was grateful for that, because you could go inside with some credibility, whereas without that, I probably couldn't have done it without credibility anyway. So, yes.
The gal from the reservation, was it Jancita?
Jancita.
Where she finally says she lied about the rape that she recanted. Was that true?
Yes.
Did she take it back?
She did, but, you know, by a strange means, but she did. This is in the book too. It turned out that there was the chief of police in Pierre at the time, Bill Abernathy was his name. And he was on duty one evening. This was right after the election. He was on duty and he got a call to go down to the Holiday Inn. There was a distressed woman out in the parking lot. And so he went down there as chief. You know, it's a small department, and I guess the chief had to make calls in the middle of the night. He went down there and he found this woman, and he asked for some ID. She was very distressed, he said, and he asked for some ID. And it was Jancita Eagledeer. And he said she had verifiable ID. And she went on, Jancita went on then, furious at the AIM people who she was with had kicked her out of their hotel room and left her out in the parking lot. And she said, here, she was telling Bill Abernathy this here, you know, I lied for them at the press conference, and this is how they're treating me. So the police chief took all this information down, and then later he did do a sworn affidavit. And I've watched that tape of him taking this affidavit, and it's a very believable tape. And he's, you know, he said, this is what happened. This woman was in distress, and I went down to talk to her. She was clearly Jancita Eagledeer because she had the proper identification.
Now, wasn't she later killed
Yeah, she was.
she was walking along the
That's correct. Yes,
road and.
that's correct. Now, there are various interpretations of what went on there too. But I think it primarily had to do with, nothing to do with Bill Janklow, but you know, the AIM factions, and were not the AIM, I mean, it was AIM versus, Dickie,
Wilson.
Dickie Wilson, who was the strong arm guy who was the tribal chief on the Pine Ridge at the time. So there was a lot of very, very violent, tense confrontations. And I think she got caught up in something along those lines and was probably murdered by an oncoming car while she was walking on the side of the road. So, you know, going back to the rape, I mean, we'll never really know. I mean, something clearly went on in that car that evening, but we'll never know. Because the two people that were in the car at the time are now, they're deceased. So.
Yeah, early on, that alleged rape case was one of the first things I heard about Bill Janklow, and I think it kind of prejudiced me until I read your book. And I found out that it may not be true at all.
Yeah, yeah. I firmly believe that to be the case. Because, I mean, it was Wild Bill, there's no question about that.
Yeah.
And he probably did do some crazy things, driving around in his car and probably shot a few dogs.
Yeah.
But I, you know, I don't, you know, he was, at that point, he was, you know, his ambition was growing. You know, he knew he had power over people. I mean, he could talk his way into any situation or out of any situation. He was charismatic, and I think he knew that he had a good future and wouldn't have undermined it by something like that. You know, and he was happily married and he had children, 3 children.
Could you go back to that second appearance before the Supreme Court and the cement company? What was that issue there?
In the cement company?
Yeah,
Well, the issue was whether or not we could refuse to sell to an out-of-state company. The state of South Dakota's cement plant, whether or not they could refuse to sell to an out-of-state contractor.
was that the first or the second Supreme Court appearance for?
That was his third and final appearance, I think.
Third and final one.
Yeah.
What were the other two, if you can?
The other two was Knipe versus the Sioux tribe. And that was a jurisdiction case between
About pasture land or something?
well, it wasn't really pasture land. It was a serious diminishment of the Rosebud Reservation. There were several counties that were impacted by that, where there was a dispute about who the governing jurisdiction ought to be. And Bill Janklow won that case.
You
but-
represented Mr. Knipe?
Yes, he was Attorney General at the time. And so he represented the state of South Dakota. And, you know, without getting into the guts of the argument, the impact was it diminished the Rosebud Reservation. And so to that extent, it harmed the reservation.
Yeah. And then the second case was?
The first case was one that arose right out of Vermillion here. A young man was busted for smoking weed, marijuana. He was busted but it was in some situation, and I'm not quite sure what it was, a party or some situation where he found himself, you know, under arrest by local police. And in the meantime, he left his car out on the downtown, and the city then towed his car out to wherever they tow their cars. Well, in the glove box of the car, he had a lid of marijuana. And so the state wanted to state's attorney at the time, and then the Attorney General's office wanted to prosecute them. But they lost that case. They argued it before the state of South Dakota's Supreme Court. And they lost it there, but they took it all the way. It went all the way to this search and seizure case, went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and Bill Janklow won there. So, so he busted some victimless marijuana smoker. Yes.
I'm pointing at Jared.
Oh.
He's raising his hand.
Oh, go ahead. Yes. Oh, Jerry?
Well.
I'm sorry, I haven't been this.
Sorry, I was a couple minutes late. It's typical for me these days. But so I might have missed something at the beginning, but I was asked to read an earlier draft of the novel, and now I'm reading the new one, and it's much improved. I highly recommend it. It's well written and dramatic and so on. I was just wondering, how many of you lived through the Janklow era? Many of you, yeah. So, you know, the rest of you, I mean, he's, I think, clearly the most important political figure in at least modern South Dakota history. And he was elected governor 2 months after we arrived here. It was 78, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we lived through the era, the whole era, 3 decades. And Norm and I were really involved with the environmental movement, Black Hills Alliance, and you mentioned that I debated in one time, but when Bernie Hunoff ran for governor in '98, I was the communications manager. So I did a lot of research and so on. And I can tell you that Greg revealed stuff that I didn't find, and I've got a big file on him. But it's a really an amazing book, and not only engaging, but if you don't know about this dominating figure, you know, this is the way to find out in an interesting way. The other thing I wanted to mention is that you know, during his career as Attorney General, well, first you probably mentioned that he worked on the reservation as an attorney and you know, was friends with you know, Russell Means and so on.
Oh, yeah.
And
I forgot to mention that.
and many other figures, important figures. And then as Attorney General, turned around and started prosecuting everybody. And I think this was really the first indication of how transactional he was.
Yeah.
And, you know, the picture you painted of him tonight is completely valid, but there's a whole darker side that, you know, you get into in the book. And, you know, when I started reading it a few days ago, I thought, wait a minute, is this Bill Janklow or is this Donald Trump?
Yeah.
You know, they have great similarities.
Yeah.
And
Well, by the way, Jerry, you missed my opening line, which was, after last night, Bill Janklow don't sound so bad, does he?
well, you know, I used to call him Huey Long without the virtues.
Yeah.
You know, you probably all know who Huey Long was, the Louisiana governor. No, he had virtues. He really did. And compared to Donald Trump, maybe he was a pretty good man.
Yeah.
But that's my opinion. Anyway, read the book. It's great.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you. Well, it's 10 after 7 already, so we've got maybe one more question and then we'll have to call it a night.
I'll second this gentleman's recommendation for your book. It's hard to put down.
Well, thank you.
Very, very easy to read. I appreciated it. Can you touch on Leonard Peltier? Do you know have any idea what prejudiced Janklow against Peltier? Because in the book, you related how apparently Janklow convinced Bill Clinton not to pardon Leonard Peltier.
Yeah, you did. And Leonard Peltier's case has been before several presidents for a pardon. And one of the last ones was before Bill Clinton, as he was just about to leave office. And apparently he was leaning in that direction. But Bill Janklow jumped on a plane and flew all the way to Washington. He had known Bill Clinton for a long time. He and Bill Clinton were on the Governors Association. And so they were at the same meetings, annual meetings, and had struck up a friendship with Clinton. You know, I don't quite understand why he was so vehement, why he was so positive that Leonard Peltier was one of the natives who had shot and killed these two FBI agents on the reservation. If you recall, there were two FBI agents in 1975 who were on the reservation right outside a compound where there were a number of natives living, including Dennis Banks. They got into a firefight, and these two FBI agents were shot in what looked like cold blood, and it was a pretty ugly scene. And for whatever reason, I mean, there was no evidence pointing to Leonard Peltier other than just circumstantial evidence. And there were two other Native men along with him who were accused of the murder, and they were both found not guilty after trials. But Peltier was on the basis of the same information, and he still sits in prison now, ailing, and is closing out his life and has petitioned presidents to be released, but unfortunately.
Robert Redford did a documentary on that case. If anybody's interested in trying to find that online, it's probably available. I saw it when it was first released decades ago. And Redford made a very convincing case for Peltier's innocence. And I think he mentioned that the FBI managed to wangle two trials. When the first one didn't go, they moved the venue to a place where people were not sympathetic with Native Americans. And they got a conviction against Peltier with just the circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of the war the FBI has conducted against Trump. I don't trust the FBI anymore, at least at certain levels. There's a lot of good people there. But this story that Redford did about the FBI railroading Leonard Peltier and the things that have happened lately with FBI, CIA, Brennan and some of those other people trying to get rid of Trump. It makes me, highly suspicious of the Peltier story.
Yeah.
The government's Peltier story.
We're all humans, and the Secret Service is going through the same kind of thing now. Thank you very much for coming this evening.
Another thing I wanted to say is that Norm and I were at the demonstration at the state penitentiary, along with Marlon Brando and Dennis.
Harry Belafonte.
Yes,
Harry Belafonte.
1978. Yeah.
1978. And during the demonstration, Russell Means was stabbed inside the prison. And
Those are tense times.
there was a lot of drama in this, man.
Thanks, everyone.